Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kamlesh Ranavardi, co-president of ColumbiaDC and a graduate of the School of Engineering and Applied Science. I would like to thank, I would like to thank our partners at the Brown Club of Washington, D.C. and their members for joining us in this gathering. We are honored to have today with us Mark Bittman, Peter Prime, Jan Knauer, and Johanna Obenda, to share their views on food and social justice. And we also are fortunate to have Emily Dietsch from the Brown Club of DC as our host. Please allow me to briefly introduce our speakers, but I would like to strongly encourage everyone to check our website for their full bios. Mark Bittman is currently the special advisor on food policy at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. Mark is also the editor-in-chief of Heightened and is working on a book and television series entitled Animal Vegetable Junk. His latest book, co-authored with David Katz, MD, is How to Eat. Peter Prime is one half of the sibling duo behind Kane, a nationally acclaimed restaurant located in DC's H Street Northeast corridor. Prior to opening Kane, he trained at the French Culinary Institute in New York and worked with some of Washington's most successful chefs, including Michael Richard and Todd Gray at Equinox. Jan Knauer is a modern Renaissance man who has made a mark in American food culture through his writing, teaching and farming and cooking. He was a food editor for 9 years at the iconic Gourmet magazine, and currently Jan stewards agricultural production and a cooking school at his centuries-old family farm in Pennsylvania, in addition to continuing his work as a writer and media presence. Johanna Obenda is a cultural practitioner and a scholar who explores the African diasporic experience through the lenses of art history and food culture. While completing her master's in public humanities at Brown University, Johanna designed Memory Dishes, a lauded exhibition that explored the complexity of African American identity and the impact of immigration on home cooking through stories and photos. Last but not least, our very own Emily Diesch is an American consultant based in Washington, D.C. She studied the history of art and architecture and American studies at Brown University before pursuing doctoral work in the same fields at George Washington University. She serves as a vice president for BCDC, as managing director for the Atlantic Black Box Project and on the steering committee of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice.
Hello, everyone. I see many folks trickling in. I see all of our lovely panelists here. So I will say hello and kind of wait for folks to trickle in, but while doing so, do a bit of a self-introduction. I'm Emily Dietsch. I am the Vice President of the Brown Club of Washington, D.C. And this event is in collaboration with the Columbia Club of Washington, D.C. For a quick framing as to this conversation that we've convened, obviously it's connecting the dots between food justice and social justice, considering that within a COVID-19 context. And also thinking about cuisine of the African diaspora as a pretty unique and fitting lens through which to consider a lot of these questions about how we feed ourselves, how that's connected to identity, how that is adapted during times of crisis or constraint, how we find joy in times of trial, and also recognize kind of the conditions of those constraints. It's kind of a big matrix to fill, but I have confidence with the lovely panel that we've assembled that we can do that. Quick note, obviously, in terms of tone and context, being heavily located in DC, the DMV area, but we have folks joining us from all across the country. Wanted to briefly recognize the unique circumstances of the past 24 hours, and that this conversation was conceived well before that. It was never entirely a fun jaunt through, culinary history, although food is always fun. We always endeavored to address more serious issues, but there is kind of a shift in the air, and personally, I feel a little bit heavier entering this conversation. I imagine many of the panelists and attendees do as well, so wanted to address that, but feel hopeful that the kinds of questions that we're addressing in terms of justice, in terms of identity, in terms of belonging, who is American, what being American means, resonates even more fully, and has a more hopeful note to the day for many of you who are here. So wanted to say that. To begin with the framework for this conversation, in terms of the origin story, this development began way back in the beginning of the pandemic, I think in April, with a note to Mark Bittman, who's on this panel, who's known for his minimalist column in the New York Times, now his work at Heated, his own enterprise, and for resourceful home cooking and engaging with food politics, and thought, this is the person we want to reach out for pandemic cooking at home. And he was very gracious and said at the same time, sure, I'd like to do something with you, but I'm more interested in the percolating social movements that are happening. And if we can connect the two, then I'm really interested. And I thought that was a fabulous way to enhance the conversation. I jumped in immediately. But connecting food justice, the conditions of the pandemic and food security that brings up for many, and social justice movements isn't kind of an automatic equation for many people. And so I wanted to start there with this panel, do kind of a quick round of self-introductions and get your thoughts about why you're interested in connecting the dots, or what connecting the dots means for you between food and social justice. So Mark, can I start with you and then we'll open to the group? Oh, we need you to unmute quickly. We're all bad at Zoom.
I'd say that the cooking part of what I've done is well known, so I'll focus on some of the other things. I was a student radical back in the 60s and early 70s and a community organizer after that. And while that may not sound particularly relevant, it was clear to me through that work that most of the issues most of the issues held dear by people who want to see progress in society are interrelated. And food, at that time, it seemed to me that food was part of this conversation, largely for its role in the environment. But now I see that food is related to other issues in many different ways, social justice being one of them, of course, the environment being another, personal and public health are also in there. So that's where my work is focused now. It's where my writing is going and has gone for the past 10 years or so. And that's what I'm focused on in my work at Columbia. It's not that I don't still cook or talk or write about cooking. I do those things, and I love them dearly, but this seems like it's more my focus right now.
Lovely. So Johanna, I'd like to pitch to you if that's all right.
Sure. Hi, my name is Johanna Obenda. I'm happy to be here. I'm a recent graduate of the Master's in Public Humanities from Brown University, and there I was a fellow at the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. So my work focused on the ways that museums and other public-facing institutions discuss the history of slavery and its legacy in a public way. And so while I was at Brown, I was able to work on an exhibition through the center that centered around women and African diasporic cooking. And that really piqued my interest in this topic and thinking about the sort of significance in something that seems very everyday, and the knowledge that's really centered in cooking and eating and other food practices. Currently, I am a new employee working at the National Museum of African American History and Culture at the Smithsonian in DC, and I'm working on an exhibition around the slave trade, slavery on a global international space, and thinking about also its contemporary afterlives. So that's a traveling show that will open in a few years.
Fabulous. All right, Peter, I'm going to pitch to you. I see you in your lovely kitchen there. And we just got off of the cooking demo with you. People got to see your kitchen before. What drew you to this conversation? How do you connect social justice and food, and tell folks about who you are and where you cook and what you do?
Peter Prime. I'm currently the executive chef at Kane. I've worked a couple of restaurants in DC, but this is my first project with my sister. I'm just happy to be included in this conversation with this esteemed group. I am, I guess, on the front lines of food justice affects me in terms of acceptance of my food, the way I move, I'm accepted in the culinary world, type of food that I do, the food of my people. And then in a real sense today, it's about accessibility and fairness for everyone, availability for everyone.
And you're being very humble, Peter, because I know also from your work at Kane that you approach food almost as a form of cultural diplomacy with your investment in liming, with kind of introducing food of the African diaspora to the American populace and showing them how wedded this is actually with American culture. That's part of your story too, right?
Yeah, I am just sharing myself, and hopefully all of those things come out of it. The way I like to eat, the way I grew up eating, trying to share hospitality, and it speaks to the way that I grew up and my culture, and I hope that it can do those things. It can bridge cultures and teach and create connections.
Yeah, it certainly does. And Ian, pitching to you too. So you came off the demo too. People have already seen you this evening, but tell us your story and your interconnection of food and social justice.
Well, I'm a cook, a recipe writer, and I have been trying for a long time to get Americans to eat better in general, which is a challenge, a broad challenge. I am married to an organic vegetable farmer who grows beautiful, delicious stuff, which is accessible to a very small percentage of people. Organic vegetables, organically raised meat is not available to most Americans, and certainly not available to populations whose skin is brown and black. And that's a problem. And it's been a problem for a long, long time. And farming in general in this country has been problematic for a long time and continues to be still. And that's all things that we need to talk about, because I think a lot of people don't even realize it. So I try to keep it light and fun, because food is fun and food is delicious, and food is something that we all share. And so it's a lighter way to approach pretty heavy topics.
It certainly is. And I always go back to, and this is my confession as a complete nerd, but I was a Latin geek. And so my first language besides English was Latin. And the word companion actually comes from the word with and bread. So the notion of your companion being the person with whom you share bread. And so food is a literal conduit so often for cultural ties and for difficult conversations, right? And so I think there's a great way that we can have fun with this tonight, but also address some of the things that are more serious and are percolating in our minds. And on that note, so in terms of the COVID context, the pandemic context, and it feels like a very long several months, it hasn't even been a year. What do you think this context has illuminated? And pick where you want to start, whether it's in terms of food security or social justice movements. But as Ian mentioned, this has all been in play for a very long time. This is not new, but it does feel like a bit of a crucible in terms of heightened attention to these topics. So what has this brought out, illuminated, or changed for you all? Peter, I might start with you if that's all right.
You know, everything has been, you know, a lot of things are convoluted. Like right now, a lot of things are happening at the same time. You know, I've seen the power of our industry. You know, we got labeled as essential. We've banded together. You know, our 10 initiative was one way that I was able to keep my restaurant going and help first responders and provide employment. But also show it, you know, the power of the national consciousness and awareness. You know, all of a sudden, Black-owned businesses are getting featured on delivery apps and on lists, and you know, for what, you know, you can take that for whatever it is, but you know, because of the timing of everything, you know, the national focus on a lot of issues has, you know, in some ways increased the spotlight for some Black businesses. A lot of others still have gotten swept away by the wayside and haven't had that focus. But yeah, you know, I'm still figuring out everything that all the ways it has affected everything. You see the power of awareness and people becoming aware and making certain decisions with the power of their money and so forth. Yeah, for me personally, I was really touched by the way our industry came together in DC and helped each other survive. you know, there are a lot of casualties, but, you know, a lot of us as well.
And Ian, I might pitch back to you just quickly because you're also kind of in a similar vein as Peter in terms of cooking, producing food, etc. So from your purview, what has this illuminated or changed for you?
Well, something Peter just said really spoke to me, which is I'm not sure all the ways that it's affected what I do, what we do yet. It continues to evolve and change. Some things have been really great. People have been cooking, which is wonderful. They've been cooking vegetables, which is also wonderful. So those are good things that have happened. Some other, I think, things that continue to evolve as far as social justice goes is the fact that the pandemic has really sort of taken an X-ray of society, and it's shown us the bones that we knew were there, and some of them are broken. And this is an opportunity, or it could be an opportunity, to reset things. And I'm hopeful that that is a possibility. As far as accessibility for food, how we continue to deal with food deserts and nutrition and education around food. I think this is a real opportunity to go down that road and course correct in a lot of places. And so I'm trying to maintain an optimistic view of the future and what we can continue to do with all those aspects around food.
All for clear eyes and optimism. So yes, thank you. And Johanna, I came to your work many years before the pandemic when you did that beautiful exhibition, and know you for the history work that you do in terms of understanding how people really cook at home and understanding how the African diaspora plays out on actual tables. So fast forward to the pandemic, how has your thinking evolved in terms of what you were already doing and the connection points that you were making?
That's a really great question. I think being in the pandemic, being in a time of like social upheaval, social activism, it's really made me think a lot about the concept of time. I think if you're lucky in the pandemic, you've maybe been given some more time. Your day's been filled with a little bit more time. Maybe you're not commuting. Maybe you're not doing the things you want to do or the things that previously you felt required to do. And so I've been curious to see like how people have been filling that time. I think a lot of people, like Ian just said, people have been cooking. Some people have had the time to protest, to do other things that they would like to do. So that's on my mind, but it actually really does remind me of the work that I was doing in that exhibition with memory dishes, and how time was something that was coming up again and again with the families that I was doing oral histories with, particularly time as it related to cooking and labor. So a lot of women were cooking very like labor intensive meals, things that would take like 6 to 8 hours. And that's with like a pressure cooker and a gas stove. So traditionally it could take even longer. And I remember thinking at the time, I was like, wow, like, I'm just all about convenience. I feel like that's what's marketed at us. And that's kind of the way our world works. We're working, we have fast food. If it's healthy, it's in a meal kit and it's going to be really quick. And these women were really making a really intentional choice to cook things that took a bit longer, and they weren't taking shortcuts, even though I'm sure there are some that they could take. And so it made me really question, like, what does it mean to choose to spend a lot of time cooking in a world that that might not necessarily fit very easily into. So I guess the pandemic made me think about time, and then it also made me think back to just 2 years ago, where that was also on my mind as well. And it makes me think about the work I'm doing now, where, we're thinking about the lives of enslaved people. What did it mean for them to feed and nurse themselves? And what does it mean to to spend time to feed yourself, to grow things in your garden, to hunt, to fish, if your time is literally owned by somebody else. And to me, there's just something very radical that I'm thinking about now around time and labor, past and present, when it comes to cooking and when it comes to African diasporic cooking, and this sort of like a reclamation of time. And maybe it is a bit of a reset, thinking about priorities, but I think for generations, people have put their priorities into things that, you know, don't really fit with the mold that's out there. So that's what's on my mind.
That's beautiful. And I love that that opens up, when we're talking about social justice issues, not just kind of racially charged issues, which have been paramount for many of us in the past year, but also questions of class, of gender, of domesticity, and so on. So Mark, you're wonderful with the 30,000-foot view. I'd love to kind of close this out with you, and make sure to unmute, sir. There we go.
I don't have a lot to add, but what's been occurring to me, I mean, I'll talk anyway, but what occurs to me is that 6 months ago, 3 months ago, I would have said, well, pandemic hasn't changed my life that much. I live in the country. I've worked from home for 40 years. It's not new to me. I'm not a super social person. I like to work by myself, et cetera, et cetera. And yet now I miss people. So it does feel different. It feels like it's long enough. I mean, even for someone as lucky as me, I feel like it's starting to be really wearing. And it's funny that it makes me think often about the fact that there's a human condition and a social condition. And the human condition is, it's not pleasant, but it's always happened that people have gotten sick and died. And so to some extent, this is something that links us to the past and past pandemics and other diseases. And my guess is we'll get over this one too. It seems like we will, but it links us in a way. It makes us all human together, which in a way is a good thing. But then the social condition, and everyone's talked about this already, so I'll keep this short. It blatantly exposed the inequality in our society, which wasn't exactly hidden to begin with, but no one could deny the differences in food access that we're seeing, and access to health care, and access to treatment, housing for many people. The one thing that I don't think anyone else said that I'll say is that it showed us that government can move and act and be on our side. Even terrible government can do some of the right things in a time of crisis. So that we have a number of crises going on right now that go beyond the pandemic, that are more deadly than the pandemic, are more destructive than the pandemic, and are seemingly permanent, or that is, they've been going on for much, much longer than the pandemic. And unlike the pandemic, there's no vaccine, there's no end in sight. So if you just want to sum these up by calling them inequality, or whatever we want to call them, these are crises that can be dealt with, and that if we see something as a crisis, the climate crisis, for example, but the food system is in crisis, class relations are in crisis, labor is in crisis. There are so many crises, and in fact, we know as a result of this, of the government's reaction to the pandemic, government can move when it's pushed and when it needs to. And if we push on the things that clearly the five of us at least agree upon, or mostly, there can be change. And not to get too far from the subject, but lost in the shuffle of yesterday's right-wing insurrection, whatever we want to call it, was the fact that the government is unified for the first time since the first 2 years of the Obama administration, thanks to our friends in Georgia, and there's an opportunity to really move forward on many, many fronts, an opportunity that we haven't had in 10 years and maybe in 50 years. So it's up to us to push on that stuff. That's pretty far from where your question started, but you asked for a bird's eye view, so.
That's exactly what you're here to do, Mark. So thank you so much for that. And it's in fact a lovely segue, because I think what you've articulated is what we precisely want to do today, which is that when we think about broadly injustice and justice, there's so many interlocking Venn diagrams of different forms of justice and injustice, whether we're talking racial, gender, labor, class, well-fed, not well-fed. These things are not often distinct, and yet we tend to approach them in silos. So I think that's one of the beauties of today's conversations. And so one quick logistical note, I'd be a bad host if I didn't say this, and encourage everyone who's here, which thank you all of you for coming. I see so many of you here. Please do chat in questions. We will do our best to interweave them in our conversation as panelists and dedicate time at the end to them. So chat to us, we'll get to them. If we don't get to them live, we'll get to them later. But moving from what I just said about interlocking circles and onto cuisine of the African diaspora, why this is part of the conversation. It's a cuisine of interlocking Venn diagrams, right? Like it's a cuisine of colonialism, travel, cultural interweaving, varying measures of power and lack of power. There's a lot that looking at that cuisine offers as a prism for these questions of food and social justice during a time of crisis. So Johanna, as I don't want to make you a spokesperson for this cuisine, it's so complex, it takes years to explain, study. Can you give us kind of a baseline for why this is an interesting prism?
Sure. Yes, I agree. Definitely not the expert in African diasporic cooking. And I feel lucky to have learned a lot from other people and other people of the African diaspora in the US. But I do think, like, when I was doing research for memory dishes and trying to understand the history of American culinary, American culinary history, it became really clear that our American cuisine is obviously a real mix of different culinary histories. So we have Native American cooking, we have different types of European cuisine, we have African food, and all these things kind of really serve as a nice basis for us. I think it's really interesting, thinking about what American cooking is today, but I'm really interested in thinking about what African American cooking is today and what Black cuisine is today. I think food scholar Jessica Harris, she talks about how we're in like a new moment of culinary exchange and culinary mixing in the US, and a lot of that is taking place in like the Black community in the US. So when we look at Black cuisine, American cuisine today, it comes from Trinidad, it comes from the American South, Latin America, Central America, the Caribbean, Africa, and in a way it's one of like one of the most like dominant areas where we can look to and see the illustration of how diverse Blackness is in the US. So from a contemporary lens, I think African diasporic cooking is also really illustrating the complexities and the nuances of Blackness in the US, and allows us to sort of tug at some of these things that are kind of complex, to say the least. And so that's something that I'm really interested in seeing. I think obviously African diasporic cooking tells us a really big history as well. You know, we see the slave trade through the food. We see different migration movements and patterns and different elements of cultural exchange. But this contemporary moment is like where my mind is. And I think, you know, obviously Black Americans have never been monolithic at all, but definitely in 2020, they're not. And we see it on the plate. It like connects us and also shows us our differences. And I think there's something really interesting there.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful, Johanna. It reminds me of the stories that you were able to share about, you know, the families that you interviewed, who are all at different connecting points to the African diaspora and to their Americanness. So various stages of immigration and being American. And for them, what was on the table varied wildly, but there was still kind of like a connective tissue among them. And it's interesting to tease out those connective points and those differences. And that actually came up in the cooking demo earlier today with Ian and Peter, because there was a key question from one of the participants about Peter's cooking. And Peter, I'll have you answer to that a little bit more. But they asked if Peter had any, you know, thoughts or senses of obligation for authenticity, given his Trinidadian roots, if he feels the need to be authentic in what he brings to the table, or if, you know, he can adapt that within what is equally his home in DC, or that he's making his home. And I think that's an interesting place to think about the African diaspora locally, right? Because it's always something different and it's always adaptable. So Peter, oh, and also Ian had asked you, you know, whether you consider your restaurant Trinidadian or American, and you said, I hadn't thought about that before. So can you speak more to that?
Yeah, really, you know, the authenticity question is, you know, it gets thrown around so much, it gets overused. I think it's a question for the consumer. For me, authenticity means being cooking or trying to cook what I tell you I'm cooking for you, or as closely as I can. So I try to set expectations, but you know, I feel if I do that, everything I cook is authentic. When I cook food at Kane, if I didn't use stuff that I knew, if I didn't do things better, the ways that I knew to do better or differently for the restaurant setting, you know, I don't think I'd be authentic to myself as a chef. I always hope for more delicious, and if I can use a different technique, I think, you know, I'm being authentic to the flavor of the food. But I think it's for the consumer to ask, you know, is my version of a dish more valuable or more tasty or more authentic? You know, I can only cook what I know and do the best that I can, try to represent the food that I say I am. But you know, I don't have to do, you know, I feel free to innovate and do what I can better, you know, when I can. It was interesting hearing Johanna talking about slow cooking and these long dishes. We tend to devalue a lot of that in restaurants. Aluminum is given this pride of place, but the time that goes into a lot of the food that we've had to learn to cook you know, because we've historically used less quality ingredients or less obvious quality, we've had to tease the value out of the food. And sometimes even, you know, it's not valued as much as an aluminum dish. And it has, you know, the consumer has to decide what actually has more value and what takes more technique and more skill.
Yeah, it's interesting, Peter, to think about not just the cultural aspect, but the economy of this, right? Like it's not just your representation or what you choose to cook, but also what allows you to sustain as a restaurateur, right? You have to think about that too. And Ian, kind of closing with you, as someone who, you know, obviously is not from the African diaspora, but is incredibly well versed in culinary history and thinks about it not just from a cooking perspective, but an agricultural perspective. And there's a big piece of that involved with the African diaspora in terms of ingredients, right? Kind of what's your connection to it, or what are your thoughts here to kind of close the loop?
Well, before I forget, I was really struck by your answer, Peter, about authenticity and how being true to yourself is step one in authenticity. And to speak to that, I think there's a dish on your menu that is called Trini Chinese chicken, which sounds delicious. And I think maybe you put oyster sauce in it as well, which is borrowing from another, you know, wonderful cuisine and is authentically Peter, right? And so I think that's a fun example of that. Yeah, the agricultural side of this is complex and problematic. And as we have been talking about, touches on all these different aspects of history and also our current situation, our current farming, our current agriculture, our current labor. The fact that in this country especially, we devalue the value of food. Americans are not willing to pay a lot of money for food, and yet somebody has to pick it and somebody has to plant it, and those people need to get paid, and they need to get paid a living wage. And there are a lot of instances in this country where they still don't. And of course, the history of slavery itself is agricultural history. And it's been problematic from the get-go. One of the things that I used to be able to do was hold farm-to-table dinners on the farm, and I miss that a lot. And what we would do 5 or 6 courses, and they were mostly vegetables because it's a vegetable farm. And so we would have a beet course and a carrot course. And occasionally I would have someone come up to me afterwards and say, it was too expensive for vegetables. And what the answer that I developed over time, and it took some courage on my part because it's always tough to talk back to customers, was that you love the meal, you're not hungry, but you think vegetables aren't worth as much. But what you don't realize is that these vegetables were planted from seed and they were harvested by a group of farmers, all of whom that season happened to have a college education and got paid a living wage. And then those vegetables were handed to cooks in the kitchen who also need to make a living wage. And in order for that to happen, you have to pay more for your meal. And if you want to support those sort of things, if we want to support those sort of things in general, we need to take a really solid look at what we're willing to pay for food, what we're willing to pay for labor, and factor that in to restaurants like Peter's or the farms where the food comes from. And I think that's going to require a reset in a lot of people's minds and a lot of what they see as the flow from the beginning to the end when it comes to the food that they eat.
Ian, thank you so much. Mark, is there anything you want to add to that?
I mean, everybody said such great stuff, which I could respond to. This is the most integrated the planet has ever been. Obviously, there are people from everywhere living everywhere, and we all have things to learn from one another. And I think about my personal cooking history and how I was lucky enough to travel around first the Northeast and then the United States and then the world and cook with people who were cooking their own food. Excuse me, the food they grew up with. And I never thought I was going to cook it the way they cooked it. And I tried to cook it the way I could cook it, which was never as good, but tried to make it as good as I could. But Peter spoke to that kind of personal authenticity very well, and that's something I feel I've just learned from everybody that I've ever cooked with, including the people, and there have been some who I knew more than. But you always learn when you cook with other people. You always learn when you talk with other people about food. I think what Ian said, it's funny, my partner also runs a nonprofit that focuses on regional food and farming. So she did farm dinners before COVID also, and we've had similar experiences to what Ian was just talking about. I think what Ian said just goes back to where we started at the beginning of this conversation, which is why there is no pure food discussion unless you're talking about cooking. There's no discussion about food that stays on topic, really. It can't. And I think that I'm sorry, I'm having a senior moment, a slight brain paralysis. When you talk about undervaluing food, and Americans pay less percentage of income than any other people for food, and we produce cheap food on purpose. But if we're to produce quality food, which is what Ian does and what many other people do, then we need to charge for it. Ian's totally right that restaurant owners like Peter should be able to make a living, and the people who work for them should be able to make a living, and the people who farm for all of us should be able to make a living. But that consideration means that cheap food shouldn't exist, or that we can't really afford to support cheap food, because there's an interesting chart that shows that if you pay more for food, your healthcare costs go down, and if you pay less for food, your healthcare costs go up. All of this is by way of trying to say, forgive me, that to have quality food, we need to be able to have less unequal society. People need to be able to afford quality food. We all need to be able to pay farmers to grow good food, and to pay transport workers and restaurant workers and so on, so that we can eat well. But that means that we also need the income to be able to do that. Some of us have it right now and some of us don't. And that's, again, all by way of saying why no conversation about food can really be strictly limited to food. It is a social justice issue. It is a social issue, and it needs to be talked about that way.
I think that's a beautiful encapsulation of today's conversation, right? And that
However inarticulate, yeah.
Yeah, we're endeavoring to connect the dots among many points of how we eat, how we cook, how we live, who we are, that are often considered separately. But for anyone who even dips a toe into this knows it's all entwined. And so it's challenging to have conversations that point out the obvious sometimes, right? Because we live this, so how do you begin to talk about how deeply enmeshed all of this is? For the remaining part of our conversation, I want to kind of touch on food present and food futures from all of you in terms of in the current moment, because of the pandemic, because of what's happening with social justice movements and kind of what we're awakening to, how we eat, how we cook, if that's changed, etc. And then also asking you to look into your crystal balls. I want to get there too. But I love, again, what all of you have brought up about the enmeshed quality of what we're talking about. And one of our attendees asked that question, Christopher, said that he's wondering how or if it's even possible to isolate and give attribution to Black American contributions to the culinary heritage of America. And Johanna, I think you addressed that a lot in what your work covers, right? In terms of assessing how deeply enmeshed African diasporic cooking is with what we consider American cooking, and why that definition of American cooking has historically been so limited in an ahistoric way.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's a good question. I don't know if there are specific ways to isolate Black American contributions to American cuisine, because just as you said, it is so intertwined. And that's kind of the way that like these cooking histories work. You know, there's just a lot of cross cultural exchange that's happening. But I think it's interesting in this moment. I'm thinking back to what Peter was talking and thinking around so the aftermath of, you know, the killing of George Floyd, and a real push to highlight Black restaurants, Black businesses, Black culinary contributions. So I think in that sense, that these things are maybe not isolated from the other, you know, the big culinary landscape, but highlighted, of course, spaces like museums and other, you know, public-facing humanities centers also do work to think through the sort of specific nature of, you know, not only African-American cooking, but African-American contribution on a larger scale. So yeah, it's just all mixed together, which I think makes it like very challenging to, I mean, you can tell with me, it's hard to articulate something very simply when it comes to African-American cooking, African diasporic cooking, just due to the nature of its origins in this country. So, I mean, I think it's a good question.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair, and it is so hard, and the very fact that the question of defining American cuisine and why it isn't a more multifaceted definition gets to the heart of what we're talking about today, both in terms of food justice and social justice, right? So kind of to the full panel, I would love to know your thoughts about both how you think the pandemic is illuminating how we eat now as Americans, and possibly a B-side question, why is it so difficult to acknowledge the multifaceted nature of American cuisine? Why is it typically a monolith that doesn't incorporate African diasporic cooking or any number of other cultural influences in a nation of immigrants?
I don't think that's true. I think it does. And I think you see food of immigrants everywhere. And I think, not to put too fine a point on it, the whitest of white Americans are eating African food and eating Asian food all the time and enjoying it, whether they know they are or not. It's true that we have McDonald's, which is kind of uniquely, or was uniquely American and made in America and iconic and all of that, but we have a zillion real restaurants and infinite fast food restaurants that are making flavorful food that relies on flavors that come from other places. So I don't, I suppose there's white food and there is tasteless food and there's indifferent food. We all know that, but in fact, I think most people, if you think about what fast food is and what cheap food is, a lot of it is very highly spiced and with seasonings that you don't ordinarily associate with kind of white bread cooking. So just wanted to say that. Maybe others disagree.
Other folks, weigh in. I have plenty to say, but Ian, go ahead.
I agree with Mark. What I think the social justice question around that point that we can think about now, or we have the opportunity to think about now in the last civil rights movement, which is what I think we're in, is that, and this applies to African diaspora cuisine, as well as Chinese cuisine, as well as South American cuisine. Do we need to recognize where those influences have come from? Do we need to give credit to the food that we eat and the influences that they have evolved through? If you quote somebody in your literature, you need to give them credit, right? If you quote somebody in jazz, you are giving them credit by quoting them. Do we need to do that with cuisine? And I don't have the answer to that. I think it's a hard thing to do, but I think it's a possible thing to do. And that's just sort of the direction that I think 2020 can point us in when it comes to that issue and American food.
Yeah, Ian, I think that's a beautiful point. And I agree with both you and Mark. I think my differing point with Mark is not that America is more just how it's represented. Ethnic aisle that is highly distilled and considered separate from American cuisine, I think gets a lot to the way that many mainstream Americans consider the American diet. So it's not so much that we're not eating in a diverse, multicultural way. It's just the way that we perceive and acknowledge those influences that I think needs work. But Peter, I'd love to have your input there in terms of how are Americans eating now, in your view, and if that's changing at the moment during, pandemic time.
I think you really kind of tied it together. It is pervasive in America. Just world food is pervasive in American food. It's just not always acknowledged or given credit. But at the same time, American food is amazing because of all the influences that have combined here. And my food is now part of the American food landscape, and just like you know, all of the immigrants from all around. And I don't think we even know actually just things that we consider as foods from other countries. We don't even know or acknowledge the African influence, food that came from, you know, from Spain and from just from anywhere. So it is there, it's just not understood or acknowledged.
So to kind of wrap up a bit and then get to some of our lovely questions that have been chatted in, what are the futures here, both for home cooks and the restaurant industry? And kind of what do you see, again, in your crystal balls for the next handful of years at least, realistically, or what you hope for? And anyone jump in, please.
You know, I think somebody said reset is the key. Just got to figure out new and better ways to do everything, achieve the things that we really want to and that are important to us. For me personally, I need to find a way to create a sustainable restaurant where, you know, front of the house, back of the house, it's sustainable for everybody, equitable. That's just me on a personal level, what I'm trying to do with my business. But yeah, it's time to reset, rethink, do it better.
Ian, how about you?
As a white male American, a person of extreme privilege in this country and in the world for that matter, I am looking forward to continuing my journey, learning about what 2020 has just started to show us and the inequality that is just rampant in this country. To Mark's point before, you know, when the rich keep getting richer and the poor keep getting poorer, the problems that we have are just going to multiply. And so when we're living in an inequitable society, where those inequities are based on race, it's not going to get better. And so we need to acknowledge the history. We need to figure out ways to move forward. And if we are able to start to continue to do that, I think we're headed in a good direction. And if we are not, then we're going to be headed in a worse direction. I think one of the things that 2020 has been very helpful with is to get people like me to understand that there's a difference between being non-racist and being anti-racist, and that the only way forward is to be anti-racist. And so I continue to look forward to having my eyes opened again and again and again, and other Americans as well, so that we can continue on the path that we are on now.
Joe, pitching to you.
Yeah, I think when I'm thinking about the future, I'm thinking back to the women of Memory Dishes and kind of the lessons that I learned from them. Like I'm thinking about what sustainability, local fairness, what that means on like an individual scale. You know, actually almost all of the women that we highlighted in the exhibition had a garden, grew their own food, really did a lot of work on their own to sustain themselves and their families. So I'm thinking about that when it comes to local. I know with the pandemic, there's been an increase in interest, I think by a lot of people who haven't been involved in agriculture before, to think about their food a little bit more, especially when there was a lot of panic buying. Yeah, so I think thinking about that is interesting. I think back to the women, there are a lot of communal food practices that people practice. You know, perhaps maybe one person in a family would be responsible for the cooking, and extended family members, aunts, uncles, you know, would pitch in monetarily, and that person would create enough food for everyone to have, which is really helpful for people who are working long hours, multiple jobs. Other people would talk about creating really big communal dishes, like one pot dishes, big stews, where those could be portioned out, not only to family, but neighbors and other community members. So thinking about the future, I'm just thinking about the importance of this sort of communal eating and care. And I think we see that. I saw in the chat someone mentioned like mutual aid networks and different types of communal ways of providing food to people who might not have access to it. I mean, that's going to be big in the future, and it's obviously can't be all on the individual, but I think there are ways that people are already doing this on a really micro scale.
Joe and Mark.
You know, I really, questions like this are very difficult because it's a question of what, not trying to predict the future is hopeless. It's a fool's game. So I think what we want to work towards, what would be good for people to put their energy towards, I think, is such a long list, and what's achievable and what's not achievable, or you just don't know. But for example, I do think that if we want to talk about food and we want to talk about justice, the fight for 15, the fight for fair labor laws in general is something that anyone can engage in, and that would make a tremendous difference to some of the people who are worst paid by society, worst paid by businesses. And many people may not know that, depending on how you look at it, 5 or 7 or 8 of the worst paying jobs in the United States are in the food system. I think that, generally speaking, change of the kind of magnitude that we need has to happen bit by bit and gradually. I wouldn't have said that 50 years ago, but I do think that now. And I think, in a way, it's important to do things like improve labor laws, or improve school lunches, or make more land available to would-be farmers or people who want to be farmers, and see how that works. See what has the kind of impact we want to see, and build on that. I think bigger picture, and you know, you could go in a direction that doesn't pay any attention to food at all and say, let's abolish the electoral college, which would be a big deal, or something like that. Make DC a state. I think that land reform has to be discussed, and I think that the fact that I can even say that is a bit of progress, because 5 years ago, land reform was a dirty term, and it's not so much anymore. I think if we want to see better agriculture, better food, more social justice, reparations, if you will, then we really have to talk about land reform in a very serious way. What do we want? We live in one of the richest countries in the world, naturally, from a perspective of our land and how well watered it is. How do we want that land to work for us? We know that the current system is not sustainable. It's not fair. It's not working. How can we make it work? What's the food system that we want to see? And recognizing that starts with land and the people who steward it. If we can start to move in that direction, and start to see farming as a dignified profession, as something that more people want to be doing and could be doing for all their benefit and that of the rest of us, that'd be really cool. I don't expect to live to see it, but that would be really cool.
Mark, that's terrific, because one of the compelling questions that came through was about policy interventions that you all might see making a difference. And I think what comes up from all of your comments on the last question about food futures, where to from here, is that it's both a policy-based thing and a cultural thing, that both things need to come into play for meaningful and sustainable changes. So kind of a round robin, if you will. Either what policy interventions do you think would be important, or kind of what sorts of cultural changes in terms of how food is represented, perceived, treated, whether on the labor front, the types of cuisines that we consider important, how we tip waiters or don't tip waiters, those sorts of things. Culture versus policy, what would you like to see? What do you think would make a difference? I think, Peter, the natural starting point is with you.
Yeah, you know, in terms of the specific policies, I'm not 100% sure what we need, but you know, we need to make the level playing field for all of the players in the restaurant. I can speak to specifically. You know, as coming up as a cook myself, I see the inequities front and the back of the house, the unsustainable nature, the kind of the tip culture, and how it affected a lot of our workers when restaurants stopped. You know, yeah, I think I don't know if it's something that can be put into policy, but it's about understanding the price of food and finding a way forward to, you know, be able to provide the kind of food that people want and provide livelihoods for everybody involved.
Yeah. Ian, I think you're the next likeliest person here, also involved in production.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Peter just said. I agree with what Mark said about a living wage. And I also agree about the cultural shift that has to happen so that people understand those things and are willing to support them. As a small business, our number one cost is labor, because we pay people a living wage. And that's, it's hard from that perspective, and it's hard from the other perspective where you're not making enough money. And so that's its own conversation about how to try and move in a direction to fix those issues as far as policy is concerned. We obviously need to do something about the police. Yesterday, we were reminded of that again. And the people who are supposed to protect us, protect all of us, need some more education, and they need some more tools so that they can do a better job. So that is front and center of mind for me, just because of the horrible reminder we saw yesterday.
Sense. Johanna?
Yeah, I mean, these are great thoughts. I don't have any specific thoughts on policy. I think in the restaurant space, I know also a lot of Black restaurants who are doing really interesting things on like a micro institutional level to, you know, provide their workers with healthcare, with really fair wages, you know, to abolish tipping. All of those things I think are really interesting. I think for the home chef, I'm going back to time. You know, I think the pandemic kind of, you know, for some people was able to like kind of move this fabric of our lives that seemed so set in stone, and people were able to have some more time to do some more cooking, to eat in ways that are a little slower. And I hope that, you know, when we're all vaccinated and things return to normal, that we can think through why we didn't have some of that time to begin with, and not go back into these systems that really keep people at work, honestly, and not at home, not able to eat the way that they want to. So it's kind of beyond even just food policy, but there's just all of this stuff systemically that is, I think, harming definitely the home cook and people in general.
Mark.
I mean, again, so much, but on a individual level or family level, like cooking is obviously really important on a, and that means cooking real food. On a community level, it means trying to help others cook real food. It means supporting your local farmer, join a CSA, support efforts to teach children about food and provide better food in school systems, and then you just go up and up and up. But I would like to reiterate something I talked about 5 minutes ago, and that is that simply put, wealth comes from land, and all the food we're talking about comes from land, good food and bad food. Land is wealth and land is power, and land was stolen in this country and then unfairly redistributed, and that has impact obviously on wealth accumulation and on people's power in the United States and elsewhere. It also has an impact on what we grow and how we eat. The way that agriculture works in this country is unfair and unhealthy on so many levels that it's a whole separate conversation. But I don't think that people make that connection quite naturally. So I just want to reemphasize that. I think the phrase is that land is wealth and land is power is real, and I think that we need to think about how land is owned and redistributed in the United States. So that's a very long-term project. I don't see it happening anytime soon, but it's a conversation we need to have.
Many things percolating. I'm going to bundle a few questions here because something that has come up as a common thread are issues of health, naturally, given the pandemic, but health and food in surprisingly different ways. So one is about the nutrition of food in particular, and if you think there is greater attention needed or paid to the nutritional content of the American diet at the moment, but also the health of the eating space, because we're all thinking about communal spaces. And Peter, when I read that question, my mind went to you first, because your restaurant is all about the communal experience, right? It's about delicious food that everyone loves, but also about liming, about that Trini experience of cultural exchange over food and a convivial atmosphere, right? So within socially distanced quarters, you know, what are the health concerns or prospects for getting back together to those communal experiences?
I mean, you know, I think we're going to be collectively scarred by this whole pandemic experience. I don't think some people are ever going to be comfortable eating close to other people in large spaces, and yeah, that's one of the resets we have to think about, like in terms of our space. I mean, I always enjoyed outdoor eating, but that's only part of it. You know, how you construct the indoor of a restaurant, it has to be different. You know, just limit the style of service, limiting contact, and but still at the same time, you know, connecting and creating that energy that people come out for and are looking for, the connection they're looking for, as opposed to staying home and eating. You know, yeah, I don't know how we're gonna do it, but it's about, you know, rethinking everything, including spaces that how we design restaurants. Can't be about maximizing people in space anymore. Has to be about the utility and creating the flow and the energy. A lot of tough questions. How
It
you
is a tough
create that.
question. Yeah, absolutely. And to the rest of you, so either on the nutrition front or kind of the health of dining together, any thoughts you'd like to add?
I mean, I wouldn't presume to know what's going to happen in restaurants. It's really hard to know. I imagine we're going to have fewer restaurants. I imagine we're going to, as Peter just said, the days of the brasserie, the kind of notion of a place that has 300 seats. I don't know that you're going to see that anytime soon. So then there becomes a question of how we support the restaurants that remain, and that's a big question. As for individual diets, that's a whole nother thing, but I think it's generally well covered, and I think I think we'd all agree that healthy food is real food, and to the extent that you can lay your hands on real food and eat that, you'll be in good shape. That's probably the easiest summary I can do of that.
Any others want to weigh in? I bet, Ian, you have something to say there.
Well, I'm no nutritionist, but like Mark, I try to get people to cook. And I think that's a good thing that's happened in the pandemic, as we mentioned before. I hope that it continues, and that people have found that making sourdough bread is actually joyful, and not a pain, not a chore, but something that is worth doing, and cooking everything else for that matter. At the same time, I don't want to live in a world where I cook every meal, and I'm looking forward to being in a place where I can be in company and eat, as you mentioned before, because that's also part of the experience that we have as humans. And I see it all the time. I taught a very small class this morning on dumplings. I had 3 people in it. Everyone was wearing masks. I've got HEPA filters. And these were strangers, spaced apart, cooking together. And by the end of it, they were no longer strangers. They were friends, And I see that every time I teach a cooking class, and I see it every time people cook together, they come together. And so to continue to preach that message is something that I will continue to do. I'm sure Mark will continue to do, and Johanna and Peter. And food brings, to sort of sum it all up, food has the power to bring people together, and that can be a really wonderful thing.
Well, Ian, you didn't know, but you just gave me a beautiful segue to our final question. We have about 5 minutes left, so be quick about a very difficult question, which was about your thoughts on the power of, talk about connecting the dots between food and social justice, the power of food, how we represent it, how we work on the food economy, how we eat together, etc., for making inroads in race relations. I think anyone who has traveled well, eaten well, has a natural answer to that, but I'd love, kind of as our closing segment, to get your thoughts on that piece of food and social justice in terms of how one can be kind of a springboard for progress in the other. Who wants to start? It's hard, right? So since Ian just spoke, I think I'll pitch to someone else. Peter, what do you think?
I think it's in some ways it's sort of simple. Food is a way to get to know other people, a way of sharing, and a lot of fear comes from ignorance and not knowing. And I think once you start to get to understand each other, it just opens the door for progress. and you know, that's why travel and eating the food does it started. And you know, in a larger sense, you know, you kind of acknowledge how connected we are and have been for longer than we've even known.
I think that's a huge point, Peter. Yeah. Mark, what about you?
I mean, that, what Peter says for sure. But also you know, I hate to keep repeating myself, but an understanding of where food comes from and how it's produced and who does that hard work, and who profits from it. If you're grateful for where your food comes from, which everybody should be, then you have to think about who produces it and how. And you know, I'm all for cooking with people, sharing food, building love and community around food. I mean, that is really, really important stuff. I do not want to downplay that, but it goes deeper than that. And food is a representation of power. It's a representation of wealth, who gets to eat well, who gets to make money off of food, who slaves in hot fields. These are things that people need to think about when they think about food.
Correct. Johanna, last word.
Well, I feel like there's not much to add to both of those statements. All I'll say is, you know, when thinking about social justice, you know, a big part of that is also care. You know, thinking about the flip side of harm, and obviously food and care are so intrinsically linked. So I do think that food plays a big role in social justice in many different ways, right? It's a big part of care. It's caring together, caring for yourself. So that's what I would add.
Perfect. I have nothing to add but everything to add, because we could talk about this for years. But thank you to all of the panelists today and everyone who showed up. We will make sure to include further information about all of these lovely people and address any questions that we weren't able to get to in a follow-up email. But my thanks to all. This certainly uplifted my spirits in a trying 24 hours. So thank you.
Bye all.
Thank you.
Everyone.